and welcome to this episode of Inside Legal ESG. My name is Pamela Cohn, and I am the founder and CEO of Amity Advisory, and I'm also the host of Inside Legal ESG podcast series. Today, we are so privileged to have with us Jon Solorzano, who is Counsel and Co-Head of ESG Task Force at Vinson Elkins. His background led him to this position, so I am going to let him tell you about his background, his career progression, and just how he ended up to be the co-head of an ESG task force at Vinson Elkins. So Jon, welcome, and tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Pam. Candidly, my background has meandered quite a bit over the years, and I'd never, frankly, heard of the word or the acronym ESG up until probably 5 or 6 years ago. I started my career, much like many of the listeners, as a corporate attorney. I worked at Skadden Arps doing mergers and acquisitions in New York City right out of law school. I did that for a number of years. I'm originally from California, so I ultimately moved back to California, where I continued to do M&A and venture financing at Orrick, Carrington, and Sutcliffe in San Francisco. And at that point in my life, I was probably about 6 years out of law school. It made sense for me to start looking towards an in-house position. I ended up moving to a biotechnology company where I was their securities lawyer, got really deeply involved in securities, an area that I had dabbled with in the past, but that kind of introduced me a little bit to some of the governance concepts that now I'm very deeply enmeshed in. After 2 years at that company, I ended up going to the Clorox company, which is a multinational CPG consumer packaged goods company, and they have brands from Burt's Bees to Kingsford Charcoal to Glad trash bags. I was their M&A counsel. I eventually stepped into the role of assistant corporate secretary, where I worked closely with the board of directors, and I led our shareholder engagement program, talking with our largest institutional investors like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and a number of active investors. That was really where I started hearing about this concept of ESG, environmental, social, and governance. We were starting to hear from our investors that, and I think that this was really where kind of the paradigm shifted from thinking of environmental and social issues as a long-term risk mitigation strategy that companies need to take, and this was being demanded from these passive investors. So I got really involved in ESG, working closely with our board of directors, helping to develop a strategy around that. And I was at Clorox for nearly 8 years, and only about 6 months ago have I come back into private practice working at Vinson Elkins, where I now lead the ESG task force. It's an area I'm very passionate about. I find it to be extremely exciting to kind of be at the tip of the spear of this really complex, now it's become highly politicized. It's just a very, I would say, top of mind area that is kind of, I like to say, we're building the plane as we fly it. It's not something that is a kind of well-worn legal path for most practitioners, and it's allows me to kind of create an indelible mark for the whole structure of how companies think about environmental, social, and governance. So I've been particularly excited, and Vinson Elkins has been very supportive of me building out this practice. So I'm really happy with how things are going so far.
Well, clearly that background puts you at the crux of all things related to ESG. From an in-house perspective as well as from a private practice perspective. So tell me what you like most about your in-house roles.
Yeah.
And what attracted you to come back to private practice?
Yeah. So in my nearly decade in-house, one of the things that I really loved, and one of the things that I felt was lacking in my previous role as primarily an M&A practitioner, was the ability to really get to know a business. When I would do transactional work, I would learn enough to help my clients execute a transaction, which was great. But it left me wanting a little bit more to really get involved in the business and the operations. Being in an in-house role, you really roll up your sleeves, and I would say 90% of my work was not with other lawyers. It was with business professionals, some of whom had varying levels of legal sophistication, but a lot of them had very specific skills that were complementary to what I did. I didn't know a ton about sort of financial modeling or audits or even manufacturing processes. And so this allowed me to really get involved and understand things. And for instance, when I was at the Clorox company, it exposed me to some areas that fascinated me. I'm kind of a bit of a geek when it comes to some things, but like I learned a lot about polymer science and how to recycle things and things that are not really legal, but have a very important bearing on our corporate strategy when you're getting pressure from your investors to understand, like, how are you thinking about plastics recycling? Well, I understand the difference now between various types of polymers and the types of mechanical recycling or chemical recycling or the value chain associated with that. That I would say is only something you can learn when you're in-house and really deeply enmeshed in the business. And some of that's the economics of it. Like, I was a sunk cost. So me like kind of learning along the way was part of the value I brought. I don't know that that would make a ton of sense for an outside lawyer at their hourly rate to be learning those types of things. But I found that to be particularly exciting. On the flip side, I would say now that I've come back to private practice, I've taken with me that sort of perspective from seeing how things are done internally and recognizing that there are inherent trade-offs in everything. And I don't think that a lot of private practitioners fully appreciate that everything has a cost. Everything is either a distraction for a business. So giving theoretically sound advice is great, but how's it going to be executed in a business that has all these competing priorities? You've got budgets, you've got different personalities pushing for different things in an organization. Being in the company allows you to kind of see that, but being from the outside, it's kind of hard. You sort of lob over guidance to the general counsel and hope that they take that guidance and execute on it. So I'm excited to be back, knowing that that's the dynamic at play and really trying to provide digestible information for my clients. And also just being exposed to even more of a diverse set of industries. I got very deeply involved in consumer packaged goods. It's a space that I love and know well, but now I feel like I can kind of make my mark on things like energy or technology or other things like that. So that's been really exciting for me as well.
So this leads perfectly into my next question. So in your role in building this ESG practice at V&E, what kind of needs are you seeing amongst your clients when it comes to ESG? What are they most struggling with?
Yeah, so I would say one of the things that's been very hard for a lot of clients is they've heard all of this pressure from shareholders or other stakeholders over the last, let's call it 36 months, saying you need to be going all in on this sustainability journey or these social topics. And now they're hearing, and I think this is because, there's sort of the external environment that's happening that like maybe companies have pushed too far or they haven't really quantified how some of this affects the bottom line. And then you're also working in a challenging macro environment where you've got inflationary pressures, supply chain issues, war in Ukraine. And so companies are like, wait, should I still be leaning hard into this or should I be pulling back? And I think the answer is yes. And I know that that's very unsatisfying, but I think this goes to my overarching guidance that I give my clients is you really need to stay on strategy, but recognize that strategy needs to look at the near term and it needs to look at the long term. And so I think companies are really trying to understand, like, how sticky is ESG? Like I heard that this is everything that I was going to need to be focused on. But now, like, should I be walking back some of the commitments that I've already made that I felt like I made because I had to, because my peers were doing it or I was getting pressure from my stakeholders? Does it still make sense for my business? And, every company is going to be different. And I'm not going to sort of paint with a broad brush and say, don't ever walk back a commitment or do walk back commitments. But recognizing that the space is so complex and you've got all of these competing interests and competing dynamics, even internally at a company, that is challenging for companies to navigate. And that's where I think good guidance from outside firms is critical, because you are seen as a trusted advisor to them. And hopefully you can bring the perspective from seeing multiple clients facing similar issues and help kind of get to the right outcome for them. And so that's really fascinating to me. It's not simple. It's not it's not without its challenges on a day-to-day basis, but I really enjoy that part of my practice.
And it's not even necessarily legal, right?
Absolutely. I kind of think of myself as I don't know, like a consultant or even just kind of a soothsayer. I don't know what the right term is, but it feels like, I certainly do advise on hard law, and I will tell you what Rule 14A8 tells you need to do if you get a shareholder proposal or what have you. But a lot of this is not pure law, and it's more fiduciary duties, and how do you think about being responsive to your stakeholders in a way that is consistent with your responsibilities to your shareholders. And it's less about pure black letter law compliance. Now, that being said, you are also looking at these issues not in a sort of jurisdictional vacuum. And so some of this is becoming black letter law in a number of places, Europe being one of them. And so it's impossible to really think of yourself largely. Most US issuers probably have some international components to their business, whether that's their supply chain or even their investor base. And so that really requires companies to be thoughtful and look externally, and not just be, looking internally at, well, this is what the SEC is saying, this is what, fiduciary duties under Delaware law say, or, I'm in compliance with like EEO or whatever it may be. You need to also kind of ladder that up to kind of the macro and understand, okay, I've got these potential regulatory requirements bearing down on me from international jurisdictions, or I've got my investors who, I owe a duty to them, and they're coming at this from a very different perspective. They want me to be taking hard climate action, and because they're looking at this through a double materiality lens, the impact of my business on the planet, even though I might not think that that's appropriate or whatever, but that's what is being demanded. So I need to be responsive to them, because their vote at my annual meeting is just as impactful as, a US shareholders vote. So anyway, that's the type of fascinating thing to me, and I really enjoy kind of stitching together that narrative and helping my clients make sense of this world.
Yep. And I want to go back to something you said earlier, because I had the luxury of introducing you at a Practicing Law Institute webinar a couple of weeks ago, where you talked about balancing ESG priorities for leaders. And one of the things you shared was how important it is to stay on strategy as in-house counsel or as leaders of a business. And particularly in the political environment of today, when is it important to step back or stay strong in whatever commitments you've made or want to make? Can you dive in a little bit deeper on staying on strategy and how that's important when it comes to ESG?
Yeah. So I use this term frequently. I call them shiny objects. I think a lot of companies want to chase the things that make them look good. And I understand that. I mean, some of being within a company is sort of the marketing element of what you're doing as a company. And so you want to get that press release that you're the most sustainable company in your industry, or you want to get those ESG ratings up, or you want to, really kind of feel like you're winning with your employees or what have you. And that's all great. But I think that sometimes that can come at the expense of doing things that are the appropriate execution steps for your business. And sometimes there's really hard decisions that need to be made within a company, because you can do all of these things and plan for the future. But if you miss Wall Street's expectations badly in a given quarter or a given year, your CEO might be out of a job. Your board might be, really having some stern conversations about, are we executing in the way that makes sense? And so I think that one of the things that general counsels in particular really need to understand is how to keep pushing on ESG where it makes sense to push, and where to pull back where it makes sense to pull back, and having that trusted relationship within the executive suite or even within the boardroom to help people understand all of this, because every single exec is going to be coming at this from a different perspective. Your CFO, they might be totally like on board conceptually with this, but they're also going to be looking at the numbers hard and being like, okay, I think we need to tighten our belt. Or I think that, maybe that massive CapEx investment for this greener manufacturing process, maybe that can wait for 5 years. And it's your job as the general counsel to not just say, sure, it's maybe that makes sense. Maybe we should be talking about a 2 or 3 year plan, given some of the demands that we're seeing from our stakeholders. And so you really need to, as a general counsel, be deeply enmeshed in your business, develop that sense of trust with your organization, and know where to push, know where to pull back, and know how to keep pushing the corporate strategy forward. And I talked a little bit about this in our discussion the other day, Pam, but I think that there are some really good tools for understanding what is critical to your stakeholders. And, I talked a little bit about materiality assessments. I find those to be a very helpful tool for understanding what is actually helpful for your business. And it takes some of the biases out of the system. They're always going to be there. But I feel like trying to make this very subjective world as objective as possible, I think really helps drive clarity onto what should be executed against and what shouldn't.
And I think a materiality assessment helps the decision makers be very thoughtful and deliberate about making some of these choices rather than chasing shiny objects, to use your words, right?
Absolutely. And it also makes some of the choices that you've made more defensible. You are going to make choices that don't please everyone. And it's helpful to have that as kind of the backstop to justify everything that you do as a company. I'm not saying you're looking for excuses, but if you say, well, we're not going to execute on that piece right now, it's because we've identified it as a tier 3 materiality issue. And that helps to bring everybody along who, even internally in your company might think that we really need to put in place this policy on whatever issue. Well, maybe that's not right for the business because there's cost implications associated with doing that. And maybe it ultimately doesn't move the needle so much with the stakeholders that matter, at least for now. I think that that's a very helpful analysis to complete.
And presumably, if the materiality assessment was conducted with engagement from a wide variety of stakeholders, and you share the results with them, then you can say, look, here's what you told us. Here's why we're executing in this direction and not that direction, right? It's a reflection of their input.
Absolutely. And then this, I think, also just feeds into disclosure generally. And I think that that's also a really important role for the general counsel, is to understand that how you're doing this stuff needs to then be communicated out in an effective way to your stakeholders. And I have probably a biased view towards shareholders just because that's the world that I come from. But in your financial reporting, in your sustainability reports or your website, wherever you're actually disclosing what you're doing, really tying that to what is important, I think is critical to do it, as opposed to just saying, oh, we donated X million dollars to this thing. Like, well, why is that thing important to your business? Otherwise, it just looks like charity. Or why are you doing this, strategic initiative? Show me how that ladders back to the corporate strategy. And I would say that fits into so many pieces. Why is your director on your board? How are they strategically important to what you've identified as important to your business? Those are the things that I think people don't realize, the interconnectivity of all of this, and they might view things in silos. And if you take one thing away from this discussion, this is all sort of intertangled, and you cannot view E, S, or G or any of the components fully in isolation. And that's why I also think that it makes sense for somebody within like the legal organization who kind of has a pan enterprise perspective to be helping to stitch all of this together.
And I would say your comment about a charitable donation, the words I use is there should be no random acts of anything when it comes to ESG, right? To
Abs-
use the words,
abs-
it has to be intertangled
Absolutely.
and
And it's
deliberate.
hard. It's hard because you're going to have somebody who has a pet project in your organization and they might have a loud voice in the room. And sometimes you do need to listen to them. But I would say that one of the critical roles of a good general counsel is knowing how developing that trust so that if you spot something that maybe doesn't feel on strategy, that you have the juice in the organization to kind of step up and be like, maybe that doesn't make sense, or maybe it does, and that's fine. And so I'm not suggesting any company should do one thing or not do another thing, but just recognizing that as a general counsel, or if you sit anywhere in the legal department, that is your role, is to kind of help translate all of these things to what's strategic to the business.
So with your in-house counsel hat on, what can law firms bring to the table that you think would be most useful for a general counsel or in-house counsel lawyers?
So I think that there's a few things. One, and maybe again, this comes from my sort of unique career path, but I think it's super helpful to have kind of a deep understanding of a business. And even if you don't understand the business, recognizing that there's this whole system in place beyond when you interact with your general counsel and give them advice on a given topic. They're going to have to distill that down and help bring their business along. There's going to be internal political dynamics at play. There are going to be significant cost pressures that you might advise you should put this policy in place, or you should not do that, or you should do that. And there are reasons that might not be practical to actually execute as you are advising them as an outside lawyer. So I think it's really just helpful to recognize that all of that is happening and try to get as deep an understanding as you can. And I recognize it's not possible if you're not in the organization to really have that, but just recognize that dynamic is at play and try to give as pragmatic advice as possible. The other thing that I didn't really appreciate until I was probably several years into my in-house career was length of like legal advice. I know that every lawyer wants to show off how smart they are and how nuanced every issue is. You need to realize that the person that you're sending that memo to is literally going to just want to forward it on to their CFO or their CEO or whoever it is. And that CFO or CEO is probably boarding a plane and looking at it on their phone. And you need to really be distilling down to the concrete points for them. And also, if you want to be doing a good job, don't make your in-house counterpart have to do a ton of work and analysis to distill down the memo that you put in place, because that frustrates them to no end. I just spent $20,000 in legal fees for you to put this memo together, and now I got to do the work to distill it down into 3 bullets for a slide that's going to go into a deck that I'm going to share with my board. Help them get there. Really focus in on what's most important. And I'm not saying don't give all of that background information, because sometimes that is critical, and depending on who you are, you might get the next question from the CFO like, why, or like, you said this on point whatever, explain more. So you need to do the work, but also really make things as digestible as possible. And I think that is a really good way to be a value add for your in-house counterparts when you're in a private practice.
I love that advice, because it's really, we should provide both, right? We can provide all the background legal research and the complete memo, but distill it into, here are the 4 things you might want to put on a PowerPoint deck for your board, right?
Absolutely. And I think your job as an outside lawyer is frankly to make your client, and largely that's the general counsel or somebody who's senior in the legal department, you want to make them look good. They need to look good to their business partners. That will keep them happy. That'll keep them happy with you. It leads to sort of just good vibes all around. And so making sure you are setting them up for success is something that I think is really important. And occasionally you have to be a bearer of bad news. And sometimes that's the role of an outside lawyer, is you can be the bad cop. And that's a role that you should embrace if that's the right role for you. Like, sometimes they want you to be like, well, my outside lawyer is saying you can't do this, Mr. CFO or whatever. And that's, just understand your role in the ecosystem and your role in helping them sort of navigate their own internal dynamics. I think that's really important, and something that I don't think that I would have appreciated had I not sort of seen that sausage get made for many years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, in the few minutes we have left, I always pose to my podcast guests, if I invite you back a year from now, which I certainly hope to do, what will have changed in the world of legal ESG? What will we talk about a year from now?
So I think a year from now, we're going to be deep in a presidential election. So
that's right.
The question
detail.
Sorry to change your question slightly. I think the question is probably, what are we talking about in 18 months? Because in 12 months, I don't know that a ton is going to change, because as you've already seen, ESG has become politicized, and it has become a bit of a talking point within some of these presidential campaigns. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like a lot of folks are being a little bit more reluctant to be out ahead on issues than maybe they would have been, a year ago. And they're kind of waiting to see where the dust is going to settle. And I do think the dust is going to settle, whether there's a new administration or the same administration or a different makeup of Congress. Again, I'm talking kind of from the US perspective here. Mm-hmm. I do think that we will see a new normal. But in the meantime, I think you're also going to continue to see heightened awareness of like climate change is happening right now. And I think that, there's a lot of people who want to maybe deny it or just be like, that's somebody else's problem in the future. But yes, it probably is somebody else's problem in the future, but it's happening right now. I mean, we're seeing massive heat waves. We're seeing, weather-related events that are actually affecting businesses now. And so it's hard for me to say in a year, if we have a really bad hurricane season, like that may actually ratchet up attention within the US. So that could move the needle. But I would say that 18 months from now, you will have probably seen the SEC rules, the final rules will have come down. They may be caught up in litigation. Who knows when they're actually going to become effective and requiring issuers to be making new disclosures. But I think that you will see a new normal. I also think that, generational shifts are happening slowly. Gen Z continues to become more of the voting base, and, baby boomers continue to, pass on. And that is going to have a dynamic shift in how the world is thinking about ESG. And that's going to have some implications on the politics of it. I think that we're going to continue the same directional line of travel. It's going to have some hiccups along the way, and there's going to be this anti-ESG pushback and then some pro-ESG demands. And so where it nets out, your guess is as good as mine, but I don't think that this is quote unquote going away. I think it's going to change, evolve. I think the conversation is going to be framed slightly differently. I think there's going to be a lot of pressure to quantify the economic value of a lot of ESG initiatives. We've been starting to see that even from the folks who are sort of opposed to ESG on principle. I don't think that they would say that if you can show me how it actually has direct correlation to value, they would really have much of a leg to stand on. And so I think that you're going to start seeing that quantification take place. And some of this is going to be as a result of all of the new disclosures, whether they're regulatory or voluntary. You're going to start seeing, I think, some quantification of this stuff in a way that has historically been talked about more as intuitive, and I think it's going to start being more quantified. So if I'm hypothesizing where we're going to be in 12 months to 18 months, I think it's going to continue progressing, maybe not at the same speed that it once was, but as soon as this electoral cycle is over, I think that you're going to start seeing some pretty aggressive sort of new reality.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And in the meantime, you and I will both be very busy. And thank you so much for all the good work you and your team from V&E is doing.
Of course.
And I absolutely do hope to have you back in 12 to 18 months, and we'll revisit this topic.
Awesome. Well, it's great talking to you, Pam.
Thank you so much, Jon.
All right.